Hey there. So, tonight, we descend into a world that's a little less about lofty philosophy and a whole lot more about deep-fried mystery. I know, you didn't expect medieval junk food to be on the menu, but here we are, grease-stained and curious. No drive-thrus, no neon signs, no late-night burrito joints, and yet, medieval folks had cravings too. And what they came up with? Well, it's a mix of surprisingly tasty, mildly cursed, and occasionally horrifying. Trust me, you're going to want to sit through this one with an empty stomach and an open mind. But before we roll up our sleeves and dunk ourselves in pig fat, do me a favor. If you like what I do here, the rabbit holes, the weird stories, the late-night strangeness, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe too, if you haven't already. Not because I told you to, but because we're about to embark on a journey that most people would never even think to take. And I'd hate for you to miss the next one. Yawn. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you right now? What time is it where you are? I want to know who else is wandering the night with me. I've seen comments from people watching at 2 a.m. in Seoul, or on a train in Helsinki, or from someone baking bread at 4 a.m. in Kansas. You're all weird, and I love you for it. All right, dim your lights. Maybe fire up a fan if you need that soft, ghostly hum in the background. Let's begin. So, apple fritters. In the grand canon of medieval indulgences, apple fritters were, well, let's call them the rock stars of the street food scene. Think of them as medieval donuts, without the sprinkles, without the frosting, and definitely without the FDA regulations. I remember the first time I tried to recreate one of these. It was in my old apartment, years ago. The oil was so old, it had opinions. I used tart little apples from a neighbor's tree, not stolen exactly, more like borrowed aggressively. I was chasing a kind of old joy, the kind that smells like burning pig fat and questionable decisions. Back in the 1300s, people made these with apples that were, let's just say, rugged. Not your glossy red delicious. These were the kind of apples that probably had a rough childhood. Small, sour, gnarled, the kind of fruit you didn't eat raw unless you were trying to make a point. You'd chop them up, toss them into a batter made from flour and eggs and often ale. Not because they were going for flavor complexity, but because water was suspicious, and ale had that cheerful buzz baked in. It's the culinary equivalent of cooking with filtered optimism. And the frying. Oh, the frying. Done in pig fat that had seen things. This wasn't your once-used avocado oil. This was fat that had been reused so many times. It probably knew your grandmother. It had a memory. But you know what? That's what gave the fritters character. They'd come out of the pan golden, bubbling, and ready to burn the roof of your mouth off if you weren't careful. If you were rich, and I mean really rich, maybe your fritter got dusted with sugar. Imported sugar, the kind that had traveled farther than most of the people in your village. It was the edible equivalent of wearing a Rolex. Everyone else settled for honey, or a spiced syrup if the stars aligned and someone in the kitchen had a creative streak. Still, rich or poor, that moment that first bite into a fritter hot from the pan, it was everything. Sweet, crispy, soft in the middle. It was joy in a world where joy usually meant not dying of dysentery that week. One bite, and for a second, you forgot you were living in a time where your best medical advice was rub some moss on it. Kids loved them. Adults fought over them. Birds tried to snatch them midair. I once read an account of a woman who slapped a monk with a fritter during a market dispute. Honestly, understandable. But not everything was glorious. Sometimes the apples were too sour. Sometimes the batter was more chew than crunch. And once in a while, you'd get one that tasted like it had been fried in oil that also cooked someone's shoes. But still, the good ones made the bad ones forgivable. If apple fritters were the donuts of their time, then cheese curds, well, they were like the popcorn of the medieval world. I know that doesn't sound glamorous, and it wasn't, but they were weirdly perfect. Ends. These little dairy clumps were essentially baby cheese. Soft, fresh, and squeaky. You'd bite into them and feel like your food had an opinion about being eaten. They weren't meant to impress. They weren't elegant. They were made fast, eaten faster, and expected to survive travel, storage, and the occasional unfortunate barn accident. Making them involved separating milk into curds and whey, using rennet, which sounds like a fancy cheese word until you remember it came from the inside of a baby animal's stomach. That's the thing about medieval cooking. The more you learn, the more you realize how much of it depended on not knowing. These curds, once salted and pressed, were eaten as is. Sometimes they were rubbery, sometimes soft, sometimes both, depending on who made them and whether or not the cow had been moody that morning. You could crumble them over a stew, fry them, or just eat them by the fistful. They were portable, filling, and had enough chew to make you feel like you were working for your calories. No one ever bragged about curds, but no one turned them down either. Urida monks swore by them. Travelers packed them. And kids treated them like medieval Skittles. I remember this dream I had once I was walking through a village fair, and some kid ran past me with a cloth sack full of cheese curds, tossing them into the air like he was feeding pigeons, or performing some ancient dairy rite. I woke up confused and hungry. So, that's the magic of medieval snacks. They live somewhere between hunger, nostalgia, and vague moral hazard. And then there were turnips. Listen, no one, and I mean no one, wakes up craving turnips, especially not in a pie. But when you're living in a world where apples aren't always in season, sugar costs more than your oxen, and desperation is considered a seasoning, you start getting creative. Or reckless. Sometimes it's hard to tell. Some long-forgotten soul, armed with stubbornness and a root vegetable, once looked at a turnip and thought, you know what? This could be dessert. That's not bravery, that's witchcraft. And so, now, turnip pie wasn't always a culinary disaster. At its best, and I use best generously, it was mashed turnips, ideally soft, mixed with egg, honey, maybe some dried fruit, and baked into a crust that was more ambition than gluten structure. You'd bite in and, well, it was warm. It was vaguely sweet. It didn't actively hurt your feelings. That counted as success. At its worst, it tasted like livestock feed that lost a bet. But it was cheap. And more importantly, it was masked inside pastry, which in medieval terms made it classy. And you could sell it at a fair. You could serve it at a feast, assuming your guests were humble or held at sword point. Even monasteries got into it. Some monks had extra time, fewer apples, and a desperate need to call something dessert. If you were lucky, they'd toss in a little nutmeg. That was luxury. If the cook was feeling wild, maybe some pepper, which honestly sounds like a dare, not a recipe. Occasionally raisins made an appearance. I say occasionally because people would argue about it for weeks afterward. Were they an upgrade? A mistake? A crime? Nobles wouldn't touch the stuff, not unless they were trying to look relatable. You know, the kind of, oh yes, we common folk do enjoy a turnip pie act that comes right before they go back to eating gilded quail. But for everyone else, this was the closest they got to sweetness on a budget. It wasn't cheesecake, but it tried. And sometimes, trying was enough. And here's the thing. Despite the logic that screamed, why? People kept making it. Year after year, recipe after recipe. It endured. Not because it was incredible, but because it was edible. Mostly. And in the Middle Ages, that was kind of a big deal. Now, let's talk about a medieval heavy hitter, the meat pasty. This was not your delicate pastry filled with finely minced beef and love. No, this was medieval Hot Pocket energy. Hot, dangerous, and deeply mysterious. A folded crust of flour and fat, sealed tight, baked golden or sometimes burnt, and filled with, well, that depended. See, meat in the Middle Ages was a loose concept. If you were lucky and lived near a manor, maybe you got pork, lamb, venison, real meat, recognizable animal. If you weren't so lucky, the possibilities expanded dramatically. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog, anything that moved and could be chopped into cubes. There's an old joke that says if it had legs, or even just looked like it once did, it could go in a pasty. That wasn't a joke back then. That was Tuesday. Spices were used generously, not to elevate flavor, but to confuse you about what you were tasting. Pepper, sage, garlic, all wonderful distractions from the fact that the meat had maybe been hanging around a little too long. Maybe it was looking back at you this morning. But the genius of the pasty wasn't in the filling. It was the format, handheld, portable, durable. You could eat it in a field, at a market, or while watching a hanging. Yes, that was a thing. The crust wasn't just for taste, it was insulation. It kept the contents warm and the dirt out. It could be marked with symbols or initials, so you didn't accidentally eat your neighbor's eel-stuffed surprise. Miners especially loved them. Some crusts were were extra thick on one edge, designed to be held with coal-covered hands and then tossed away, or left as an offering, or a rat snack. Vegetarian versions existed too. On fasting days, you might find one stuffed with leeks, turnips, or beans. But let's be honest, the ones people actually fought over had meat, or something vaguely resembling it. And you didn't ask questions. That was part of the experience. You took a bite, and you hoped. It was a little dangerous, a little greasy, a little bit like falling in love at a tavern. You knew it might end badly, but what if it didn't? Now, speaking of danger disguised as delight candied fennel seeds, these were tiny, pretty, and hard enough to take a tooth clean out of your skull. They were the closest thing medieval folks had to breath mints, or maybe jawbreakers, depending on your confidence level. Little fennel seeds coated in layers of boiled sugar, a feat of alchemy, considering sugar had to be imported, pounded, boiled, and then poured in such a way that your kitchen didn't explode. Won't, but they did it. And the result? A tiny, crunchy herbal candy that either freshened your breath or cracked your molar, sometimes both. Fennel by itself is already divisive. It has that black licorice flavor which some people love and others fear. Now imagine that, but in seed form, coated in medieval sugar, and handed to you after a feast as both a treat and a digestive aid. That's right, these weren't just for breath. They were supposed to help you survive the 3 types of roasted bird and suspicious stew you'd just consumed. The rich loved them. Of course they did. They could afford the sugar. They'd sit around after meals, nibbling fennel seeds and pretending their breath didn't smell like goose grease and entitlement. For the common folk, knockoff versions existed, usually involving herbs, honey, maybe crushed seeds, optimistic approximations of the real thing. Oh, sub. I've tried them once, the modern kind, of course. Bought them from a spice shop run by a man who looked like he owned 3 ravens. Popped one in my mouth, and immediately understood why they weren't more popular. They're not for chewing. They're for patience, for slowly dissolving while contemplating your life choices. Still, they had their place. Small, odd, a little fancy. They didn't fill your belly, but they gave the illusion of refinement, even if your shoes were made of bark and you smelled like fermented cabbage. Now, if there was one medieval dessert that could walk into a feast and instantly command attention, it was the honey cake, dense, sticky, slightly aggressive in texture, but sweet gloriously, unapologetically sweet. The kind of sweet that makes your jaw tighten a little and your eyes water just enough to feel like something meaningful happened in your mouth. Honey cakes were made not just for taste, but for survival. Sugar, remember, was rarer than a happy monk with free time. But honey, that was the sweetener of the people, provided you had bees, or access to bees, or the kind of personality that wasn't afraid of climbing trees and getting stung repeatedly in the face. These cakes started with flour, water, and sometimes eggs. Then came generous scoops, or medieval spoonfuls, which could mean anything from a pinch to half the pot of honey. The batter was poured or slapped or smooshed into pans and baked near the hearth, ideally without setting your tunic on fire. The result wasn't light. It didn't bounce. It didn't fluff. These cakes had gravity. You could knock on them. You could use them as a doorstop or self-defense weapon. Slicing one required a steady hand and a sturdy knife. Eating one? That was easier. You just needed commitment. And maybe a wet cloth nearby for your hands, because the honey would cling like an emotional X. I once tried making one, just to see. Took a recipe inspired by a 14th century scroll. Let's just say it turned out more like a medieval protein bar. Dense, sticky, enough to make my kitchen smell like victory and bees. Occasionally spices were added, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, if the household was rich or someone had a cousin in spice trading. Dried fruits might make a cameo if they hadn't already been turned into wine or stolen by local urchins, but most of the time the cake was just honey and mussel. You'd find them at weddings, feasts, festivals, and funerals, because nothing says life is fleeting, like a cake that's hard enough to chip a tooth, but sweet enough to remind you life had its moments. And they lasted. Oh, did they last? I've read tales of cakes being made a week in advance and still being served like nothing happened. The honey preserved them, sort of embalming them in sugary glory. You could drop one and it would bounce. You could forget one in your pantry and find it 3 months later, unchanged, defiant, waiting. And despite their toughness, people loved them. Because in a world where dinner might be boiled turnips and yesterday's bread a honey cake was a miracle. It was warmth. It was celebration. It was the taste of maybe things aren't so bad. And that brings us to one of the least expected delicacies in the medieval snack spectrum: fried fish, skin cracklings. Yes, you heard that right. Fish skin, fried, crisped into something that, against all odds, was genuinely good. Think potato chips, if they were made from the ocean's spare parts, and had a slight aftertaste of judgmental herring. No one planned this. No medieval chef woke up and said, "Ah yes, today I shall invent the gourmet crunch of the future." More likely, someone looked at a pile of fish scraps, felt poor, and thought, what if I just threw this into hot fat and hoped? And it worked. In coastal towns or river settlements, fish skin was everywhere. The meat went into stews, the bones into broth, the heads to the cats, and the skin, well, that's where the magic happened. Toss it into sizzling pig fat, let it hiss and curl, and you got something crispy, salty, and undeniably satisfying. So, they were lightweight, easy to carry, high in fat, and oddly loud, the kind of snack that crackled so hard it overpowered conversation, which, in a tavern full of shouting drunks and lute players, was probably a bonus. Sure, they smelled like Neptune's laundry basket. Frying a batch indoors could turn your home into a fishy sauna for days, but that smell came with flavor. The kind of flavor that made people nod and grunt in approval, even as they wiped oil from their chins. They didn't travel well, unless of course you were already traveling through a fish market and had lost your sense of smell. But they were popular. Sailors loved them, soldiers packed them, peasants sold them outside inns to make a few coins and feel useful. It was a working class miracle, a reminder that nothing, not even fish skin, had to go to waste. And now we step into something that feels softer, sadder, somehow more desperate. Alley-soaked bread. This wasn't even a dish. It was a coping mechanism. Picture it. You're cold. You're poor. You've got yesterday's bread so hard it could break a window. You've got some ale, maybe flat, maybe sour, maybe brewed in a neighbor's goat shed. What do? You dunk the bread. You dunk it deep. This dish went by a few names: soups, trench toast, slop on purpose, and it was the medieval answer to, we have food, technically. No eggs, no spices, no joy, just bread soaking in weak ale until it softened enough to chew without spraining your jaw. It was eaten by workers, soldiers, and people who had long ago stopped dreaming of dessert. And yet, it was comfort. The ale gave it warmth, a kind of bitter hug. Sometimes people got fancy, a sprinkle of herbs, a bit of cheese, maybe a fried egg if the stars aligned. On holy days, spiced ale might make an appearance. That was the pinnacle, the holy grail of stale bread resurrection. But most of the time, it was simple. Bread, ale, regret, swallowed with a sigh. You didn't eat it to impress anyone. You ate it because it was there, because you needed something warm, something that felt like food, even if it also felt like failure. Still, for what it was, it worked. It filled you, it soothed you, and it taught you a lesson that medieval cuisine repeated often: when in doubt, soak it, fry it, or hide it in a crust. Which brings us weirdly to sops in wine. Oh, yes, it's still soggy bread, but this time it's dressed up. This was what happened when nobles got philosophical about sadness. Toasted bread dipped in sweetened wine, mulled wine, spiced wine, wine that had been fermenting so long it had opinions about your haircut. You'd take your crust, drop it in the goblet, watch it drown, then fish it out and eat it with a spoon. But it wasn't dessert. It was an event, an experience, a statement. It said, I have too much wine, too little time, and a vague need to feel pensive. Well, you'd find sops in wine at the end of awkward dinners, the kind where no one knew how to talk about politics without stabbing each other. Instead, you passed around bowls of wet toast and pretended it was fine. When it worked, it was lovely. Warm, soft, spiced, like a drunken bread pudding having a crisis. When it didn't, it was just wet bread in a bowl, and no amount of cinnamon could fix that. Now, let's talk about dried fruit. Today you think of trail mix, cute little packets, resealable pouches, maybe a raisin stuck to the side of a banana chip. But back then, dried fruit was war rations dressed up like candy. It was the treat you got if you were lucky, or holy, or knew someone who traded with someone who definitely didn't ask for receipts. And Trishways, we're talking figs, raisins, dates, prunes, if you were feeling fancy. They were dried on rooftops, on cloths, on windowsills, sometimes on purpose. Sometimes someone just forgot. You'd come back 3 days later and say, "Oh, look, a chewy miracle." Taste, intense. Sweet, absolutely. Texture, let's just say it fought back. You didn't nibble medieval dried fruit. You wrestled it. You earned it. A single raisin could stick to your tooth like it was trying to live there rent-free. A dried fig might have enough seeds to qualify as gravel. Still, people loved them. Why? Because they were sweet. Sweet meant luxury. Sweet meant calories. Sweet meant for a fleeting moment, joy. Nobles used them in everything. Pies, cakes, porridge. Sometimes they were wrapped in pastry, soaked in wine, or laid out on gold plates, just to show off. "Look at me," they said. "I can afford fruit that died slowly." And for everyone else, a raisin on a feast day was like winning the lottery. You'd chew it slowly, hold it on your tongue like a relic. You'd hide it, hoard it, maybe split it with your siblings if you were feeling generous, or being watched. Storage was simple. They were packed in clay pots or cloth sacks and could last months, years even. There's a story, probably apocryphal, of a man throwing a dried date at someone who insulted his beard. It didn't shatter, it bounced. That's the kind of longevity we're talking about. So, yes, dried fruit in the Middle Ages? Not soft, not pretty, not Instagram-worthy, but precious, dense, sweet, and a reminder that even the smallest things can taste like wealth. But not all medieval snacks were sweet. Oh no. Enter blood pudding balls. Yeah, let that name sink in. Huh? I remember the first time I read about them. I blinked, reread the paragraph, then whispered to myself, "They fried what?" These were the heavyweights of medieval protein. Literal blood, usually pig, but no one was picky mixed with oats, onions, suet. That's beef fat for the blissfully uninitiated, and a medley of spices that all whispered, "You don't want to know what's in here." This mixture was rolled into balls, then fried until the outside crisped up and the inside stayed dark, rich, and deeply iron forward. And weirdly, people loved them. They were dense, bold, unapologetic, the kind of snack that made you sit down, breathe deep, and think about your choices. 2 balls in, and you didn't need lunch. 4, and you might question reality. Nobles might serve them with ale or eggs. Peasants just ate them straight, grateful for meat in any form. You didn't eat a blood pudding ball because it looked good. You ate it because it was hot, fried, and proof that you were alive and planning to stay that way. These weren't snacks, they were statements. You'd find them at fairs, roadside stalls, anywhere someone had access to a pig in a frying pan. They were especially beloved in colder months. Why? Because nothing warms your soul like congealed fat and blood in orb form. Texture? A little grainy, a little chewy, a little confusing, but if you grew up with them, they were comforting, like biting into something that reminded you your ancestors didn't flinch. I've never tried one, not out of fear. Well, okay, maybe a little fear, but because I'm not sure I could do them justice. Some foods demand reverence, others demand a strong stomach. Blood pudding balls demand both. Now let's soften the blow with something deceptively humble. The medieval pancake. Forget everything you know. These weren't stacked. They weren't fluffy. There was no syrup, no whipped cream, no warm fruit compote. These were fried flour discs, cooked in so much lard they glistened like medieval vinyl records. But they were beloved. Made from flour, eggs, and ale or water, whichever was less suspicious that morning, they were poured onto hot iron griddles and cooked until the edges crisped. The center softened, and the entire thing smelled like breakfast plus ambition. They were fast, flexible, democratic. Everyone ate them. Rich, poor, monk, merchant. You could have them plain, add herbs, add cheese, dunk them in broth, roll them up, eat them in the fields, in your home, or while pretending to be fasting. They were especially popular during Lent, when meat was off limits and people needed loopholes. Pancakes became the edible wink to the heavens. "No meat here," they'd say, while being fried in pig fat and stuffed with anything vaguely savory. And sometimes they were burnt, or undercooked, or weirdly chewy, but no one cared, because pancakes, even medieval ones, were comfort. Simple, greasy, reliable. You didn't eat them to impress. You ate them to survive and to feel like, just maybe, you weren't entirely at war with the day. Which brings us to something far thinner, crisper, almost holy. Wafers. Yes, wafers. The communion cracker-style biscuits that walked a delicate line between snack and religious relic, made from flour, water, maybe eggs, and cooked in hot irons pressed together like a medieval panini press for flat people. On me you want. They weren't sweet, unless you had honey. They weren't rich, unless you layered them with cheese. Most of the time, they were just there brittle, light, easily shattered like the dreams of peasants and theology students. But people adored them. They were sold outside churches, handed out at fairs, bought by the dozen, and eaten immediately before they crumbled into dust. Vendors shouted over the crowds, waving stacks of warm wafers, like edible fans. They cracked if you looked at them wrong. And if the wind picked up, goodbye, snack. Hello, regret. Still, they were elegant, modest. The kind of snack that made you feel mildly festive without committing to a full meal. Nobles might stack them with fruit. Everyone else just ate them plain, chewing thoughtfully, pretending not to be disappointed. Wafers were the edible equivalent of, well, it's something. And in the Middle Ages, that was enough. Now, buckle in. Because we're about to talk about something called sucket. I know, it sounds like a threat, or a dare, but sucket was actually fruit. Boiled again, drenched in syrup, then sealed in a jar and served like it was the climax of the feast. This wasn't a casual treat. It was reserved for nobles, royalty, people who thought a roasted swan centerpiece wasn't quite enough to show off. Sucket was status. You'd serve it on ornate trays, each piece glistening like a jewel. Ginger, dates, oranges all turned into sticky little morsels of wealth. It took forever to make. You didn't just boil the fruit once, you boiled it again, and again, until it surrendered to the sugar and gave up its will to rot. The result? Chewy, intense, sweet enough to make your conscience whisper, you shouldn't be eating this. But you did, because it was sucket, and for a moment your teeth were drowning in opulence. Fools. Commoners never tasted the real thing. They had knockoffs, maybe honey-soaked apples, maybe dried pears boiled in optimism. But the real sucket? That was a sugar-drenched whisper of power. And now, our grand finale. Fried eel. Yes, I saved the best, or at least the slipperiest, for last. Sue. Eel was everywhere in medieval Europe. Rivers teemed with them. They were cheap, abundant, weirdly nutritious, and if you could get past the part where they looked like sentient nightmares, they were actually pretty tasty. But it was the frying that changed everything. You had to catch them first, of course, usually at night, with traps, nets, or wild determination. Then you had to skin them, an experience that's been compared to peeling a greased rope that doesn't want to die. Once prepared, they were chopped, seasoned if you were feeling generous, and fried in oil until the outside crisped and the inside turned firm and flaky. The taste? Somewhere between chicken, fish, and don't ask, just chew. The smell? Powerful, lingering, room-clearing. But the people loved it. It was served at fairs, in taverns, on banquet tables. Monks ate it. Nobles bragged about it. Kings had it baked into elaborate pies and served it during fasts because, technically, eel wasn't meat. Loopholes. And yes, it had bones. Lots of them. And yes, it sometimes twitched after death. But still, fried eel was a miracle. A greasy, glistening, slightly cursed miracle. And that, my friends, is medieval junk food. Let's turn off the frying pans now. Wipe your hands. The oil has cooled. The fairgrounds have emptied. Because tonight, our journey drifts somewhere else. Into the dark. Into the quiet, humming chamber of the ancient world's most secret obsession, dreams. Not the, I wish I had a pony kind. The kind that whispered in your sleep, coiled around your thoughts like incense smoke, and told you that the gods had something to say, and you'd better listen. To the people of Mesopotamia, Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, a dream wasn't a flickering thought you forgot by morning, it was a telegram from the heavens. a divine push, an omen in disguise. Ignoring it? That was like hearing a knock from a god and pretending you weren't home. Dangerous. By 2500 BCE, they had dream manuals, clay tablets, cuneiform inscriptions categorizing dreams like strange, sacred math. Dream of a lion? This happens. Dream of losing your teeth? Someone's going to die. Dream of flying? Victory or madness. Depends how high. They didn't guess. They knew. Or they thought they did. And if you were important, a king, a priest, a general, you didn't just wait for dreams. You summoned them. You incubated them. That's the word they used. Incubation. You'd go to a temple, cleanse, fast, lay on sacred stone, maybe burn some incense, sleep there, right under the gaze of a statue that didn't blink, and if the gods were generous, they'd slip into your dreams and speak. The dream world was a realm you entered on purpose, like diving into a pool with something at the bottom, buried truth or buried terror. And sometimes, what you surfaced with changed empires. They had priests for this, the Baru, dream interpreters, like therapists and prophets rolled into one. They studied tablets, matched symbols, weighed omens. They were trained, precise, reverent. You didn't just wake up and say, "Weird dream last night." You said, "I need the Baru. The gods are speaking again." And if the dream was bad, there were rituals, charms, fires, actions to cancel it, erase it, before it could take root in the waking world. Because dreams weren't private, they leaked into real life. Saw it, and for them, that made perfect sense. The Egyptians saw it similarly, but with their own twist. Dreams weren't just messages from gods, they were visions from your Ka, your spiritual double. Every dream had meaning, every vision had intent. If you dreamed, you were being addressed. By the time of the New Kingdom, they had dream books, papyrus scrolls filled with hundreds of dream types, each followed by a ruling. Good, bad, weird, fatal. If a man sees himself eating crocodile flesh, it means he will become a high official. Makes no sense, right? But to them, totally logical. Crocodile meant strength, power. Eat it, and you absorb that power. Clarity by way of chaos. Each entry started with, if a man sees himself, because it wasn't about vague metaphors. It was specific, patterned, ritualized, and deeply believed. And if your dream was marked in red ink, that was bad news. The red meant danger. You might need a priest. You might need incense. You might need a different pillow. They also incubated dreams, slept in temples, especially those dedicated to Thoth or Serket gods of wisdom and healing. It wasn't superstition. It was spiritual medicine. You laid down your body hoping your soul would wander far enough to bring back something useful. They even had erasure spells, little invocations to forget a dream before it could damage you, like psychological antivirus software, spoken before breakfast. And it wasn't just ancient Egypt. The Greeks took dreams to a new level. In their world, dreams were healing appointments with the gods, especially with Asclepius, the god of medicine. They'd sleep in Asclepeia, healing temples built specifically for this purpose. You didn't get prescriptions, you got visions, snakes slithering across your body, the god whispering, touching your wound. You'd wake up healed, or at least told what to do. And even the most scientific of Greek minds, Hippocrates, Galen paid attention to dreams. They saw them as diagnostic tools, your body speaking in symbols. A river meant your kidneys. A collapsed wall meant your lungs. You learned to read yourself from the inside out. But the most important Greek in the dream game, Artemidorus of Daldis, 2nd century CE. He wrote a 5-book manual, the Oneirocritica. He gathered stories from sailors, soldiers, merchants, prostitutes. He believed dreams revealed your truth, but only if you understood the context. Dreams weren't universal, he said. They meant different things to different people. Dreaming of fire meant loss for a farmer, but inspiration for a poet. Your class, your job, your fears, they all mattered. It wasn't mysticism. It was study, observation, a kind of psychological archaeology. And his book? It lasted, through Rome, through Byzantium, into the Islamic world, into medieval Europe. It was the Rosetta Stone of dreams for over 1,000 years. That's how seriously they took it. Dreams weren't side thoughts. They were statecraft, prophecy, magic, diagnosis. They weren't separate from the waking world. They were its mirror. And sometimes they were weapons. Because let's be honest, if you were a ruler and you claimed a god spoke to you in your dream, who's going to argue? Alexander the Great said Amun came to him in a dream, called him son. Caesar's wife dreamed of his death the night before he was stabbed. Augustus claimed dreams led him to victory. Hatshepsut's mother dreamed that the god Amun fathered her child. Dreams were divine endorsement. If the god spoke in your sleep, no senate could silence you. But not all dreams were gifts. Some were curses. Dark, fevered visions believed to come from restless spirits, angry ancestors, or demonic entities. Nightmares weren't shrugged off. They were seen as infections, spiritual contamination. If you dreamed of being chased, crushed, bitten, that wasn't random. That was a message from the other side. Babylonians called priests to burn cedar. Egyptians clutched amulets shaped like eyes and lions. Greeks called on the Furies, the chthonic gods who delivered nightmare justice. And always, always there were people ready to decode, to warn, to cleanse. Because the message was never just the dream. It was what came next. The ancient Hebrews knew this power well. Dreams weren't side quests in their stories. They were divine dispatches. Think of Joseph. Not the carpenter, the dreamer. The one with the coat. He dreamt of sheaves of wheat bowing down, of stars and moons bending toward him. And what happened? His brothers sold him. Then he rose to power in Egypt. All because he took his dreams seriously, and more importantly, so did others. Later, in Pharaoh's court, it was Joseph again who read the meaning in dreams, fat cows and thin cows, predicting feast and famine with eerie confidence. One man's sleep became a kingdom's salvation. To dream in the ancient Hebrew tradition was to step into a private chamber with the divine, and to interpret dreams, that was to wield power. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had dreams he couldn't understand. He called his magicians, his sages. None could help. So he summoned Daniel, another dreamer, another interpreter. And Daniel told him the truth, told him of empires rising and falling, told him things no one else dared say aloud. And so, a dream became prophecy, politics, history. This pattern echoes everywhere. Assyrian kings wrote about dreams that foretold their victories. Romans listened when the gods whispered in their sleep. Even Nero. Yes, that Nero kept dream interpreters on staff. He should have listened more. And the Greeks. They had a word for dreams that came from the divine. Onairoi alathenoi. True dreams. These weren't symbolic. These were the gods handing you a script. And yet, even the false dreams mattered. Because all dreams, in a way, were messages, whether from heaven, your subconscious, or something in between. And that's the terrifying beauty of the ancient world's view on sleep. There was no such thing as just a dream. Even the nightmares. Especially the nightmares. If a shadow chased you in your sleep, that meant something. If your teeth fell out. If your mother cried blood. If a snake whispered your name, those weren't accidents. Those were signs. The Babylonians called them evil dreams, dreams polluted by demons, or the angry dead, rituals to wipe them away like soot from a wall, spells spoken at dawn, incense burned before breakfast, actions to stop the vision from blooming into reality. Egyptians would carve protective symbols into amulets, sleep with one under the pillow, an eye, a scarab, a lion-headed god grinning into the dark. In Greece, a nightmare might be blamed on Hades, on Persephone, on the Furies, gods of vengeance and remorse, chthonic visitors reminding you of wrongs that needed righting. You didn't dismiss these dreams, you atoned. Because even in sleep, you were being judged. Plato, ever the philosopher, wrote of dreams as battles between our better and baser selves. When we dream, he said, we see what we truly are, or what we're too afraid to admit. It was the soul, unsupervised. And then, the Romans. Practical, organized, and absolutely obsessed with omens. A dream of owls. Bad. Wolves? Worse. Your dead grandmother appearing and frowning in Latin? Time to revise your will. Won't. They believed dreams could come from beyond the veil, that the dead still had things to say. Advice, warnings, accusations. Dreams were a phone call from the afterlife. And if you ignored them, well, you didn't. You consulted an interpreter. You wore a charm. You made an offering, because whether it was a whisper from the gods or the ghost of a wronged cousin, dreams had weight. They carried meaning. And that meaning wasn't just spiritual, it was social, political. Rulers used dreams to justify wars, to declare peace, to legitimize themselves. Alexander the Great dreamed of God's blessing him. His men believed it. His enemies feared it. Emperors built temples because a dream told them to, or punished enemies because a dream foretold betrayal. I saw it in a dream, they'd say, and who could argue? Even commoners played the game. A dream of fire might mean a rival's misfortune. A dream of fruit might promise fertility. If a man dreamed his wife turned into a cow, well, interpretations varied. But everyone believed. That's the thread running through it all. Belief. The belief that when the world falls silent, when your eyes close and your body forgets itself, the truth comes out. Raw, symbolic, confusing, terrifying, holy. And then, the silence begins to speak. Because the conversation about dreams didn't end in temples of stone or beside golden statues. It evolved. It moved. It reached into the vast heart of another civilization, one that honored dreams not only as symbols, but as legitimate, sacred experience. Islam gave dreams a structure, a place, a language. For me, as a Muslim, dreams aren't just whispers in the dark. They're one of the few remaining threads that still connect us to the unseen world with clarity. After all, in Islam, dreams are considered one of the 46 parts of prophecy, and that carries weight. The Prophet Muhammad had dreams, not vague ones, not riddles, true dreams. Before revelation came, he experienced them for 6 months, each one unfolding exactly as it appeared. This wasn't coincidence. It was preparation, a gentle descent into the realm where the soul could receive without distortion. And even after revelation began, the prophet continued to speak of dreams, not only his, but those of his companions. Some were glad tidings, some were warnings, some were personal, and others held meaning for the entire ummah. There's a narration one that stays with me where the prophet said, "A good dream is from Allah, and a bad dream is from Shaitan. So, if any one of you sees something he dislikes, let him spit lightly to his left 3 times and seek refuge in Allah, and it will not harm him." Simple, direct, spiritual hygiene. A method to distinguish between what lifts you and what seeks to disturb. And it wasn't just theory. Early Muslim scholars, mystics, even rulers took dreams seriously. Imam al-Nawawi wrote about dreams. Ibn Sirin famously compiled interpretations, not superstition, but frameworks, a way of reading the signs without falling into delusion. But even Ibn Sirin warned dreams must be interpreted by someone with both knowledge and taqwa, piety, because dreams are subtle, slippery. A symbol for one soul might mean the opposite for another. Without grounding, dreams can mislead. I've always found that balance fascinating. The same tradition that opens the door to divine communication also places guards around it. It says, yes, listen, but also beware. Know who you are. Know where your heart stands. Because Shaitan can speak too. He can whisper in that quiet space between waking and sleeping. His goal, confusion, fear, doubt. So, not all dreams are welcome. Not every vision is holy. Some are simply echoes, memories, leftovers from your day. Others are temptations, disguises, mischief cloaked in the shape of someone you trust. But then, there are those few. The ones that arrive like a light, that pull you upright in bed, that sit with you all morning. You don't know why, but you know. Those are the ones you carry to a scholar, or keep between you and Allah. Yeah, I've had them. I won't describe them all here. Some things aren't meant to be shared. But I will say this: in my lowest moments, when clarity seemed like a distant country, a dream would come, and not a loud one, just a presence, a feeling, a reminder that something beyond me still watches, still guides, still speaks, if only I remain still enough to listen. And in those moments I'm reminded, this isn't new, this is ancient. We've always done this. Since the very beginning, humans have known the night isn't empty. It listens, and sometimes it answers. Retudes. So when I hear someone dismiss dreams today, when they say, "It's just your brain firing off signals," I nod, politely. Because yes, sure, there's biology, there's neurology, there's REM and memory and hormones. But that's not all. Because sometimes you wake up with tears you can't explain, with a heart that feels warned or forgiven or seen, and no amount of science can account for that. That's the dream realm. It's the liminal space between dunya and akira, between ego and ruh, a place where veils thin and meanings wear masks. And Islam doesn't just allow this. It teaches us how to live with it. Today, we act like dreams are a sideshow, a curiosity, a psychological tick, something to laugh about in the morning or post on social media. But deep down, deeper than the distractions and dopamine loops and endless blue light, we still know. We feel it. There's a reason we wake up shaken after certain dreams, a reason we go quiet, even when we don't fully understand what we saw. Because some part of us, some very old part, remembers what our ancestors always knew. Dreams are not accidents. They're not debris. They're not irrelevant static in a busy brain. They're signals, maps, messages. Not always literal, not always clear, but always worth listening to. Even modern science, in its relentless slicing of mystery, is circling back to what the ancients intuited. REM sleep, lucid dreaming, trauma dreams, subconscious pattern recognition, symbolic thinking, archetypes that repeat across cultures. Jung called them the collective unconscious, that river beneath us all, where the same images appear: the shadow, the serpent, the flood, the mother, the falling tooth. Where did that come from? Why do people across time and place dream the same strange dreams? Why do we still, in this so-called age of reason, dream of death, flight, fire, ancestors, unknown cities, and messages written in symbols no one taught us? I say, the ancients would have smiled at our confusion. They'd say, "Of course you dream in symbols. It's not your world you're visiting. It's theirs." Dreams are the common tongue of the human soul, spoken not in grammar and words, but in meaning. And meaning never dies. Even now, in an age of satellites and smartphones, you'll find people quietly, secretly keeping dream journals, asking imams or elders about strange visions, praying istikhara and waiting for an answer in sleep. Because we still believe, even if we don't say it out loud. We still wait for the whisper at night that says, "Go," or "Stay," or "You are not alone." And when it comes, even if it makes no sense, we feel it. The hair rises, the air changes. We wake up knowing we've been visited. Not every dream is a sign, but some are. And that's enough. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you wake up from a dream, don't just brush it away. Sit with it, write it down, ask what it might mean, not just literally, but spiritually. Ask who it came for, what it came to stir. Because maybe, just maybe, it wasn't just a dream. Maybe it was a knock, and now it's your turn to answer. If this journey through medieval cravings and ancient dreams lit something in you, you know what to do. Like the video, subscribe, leave a comment below, tell me about a dream you've never forgotten, one that stayed, one that still pulls at your sleeve now and then. This channel isn't just about stories. It's about that strange space we all share between history and imagination, between waking and sleep, between what we know and what we suspect. Thanks for walking with me. Now go, sleep well, and pay attention. The night might speak again.